All right, everybody, buckle up because today we are diving headfirst into a pretty intense situation up north. We're talking Canadian politics, folks. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. You know, the guy with the great hair. Well, he's facing a potential crisis, and it all comes down to tariffs and some tension with the U.S.
Yeah, this isn't just like a little disagreement. We're talking a potential 25% tariff on Canadian goods. And the person behind it, well, let's just say he's no stranger to making waves.
Oh, yeah. I think we all know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Former President Trump.
The one and only. And he chose his favorite platform to make the announcement, of course.
Truth Social.
Where else?
It's kind of like a blast from the past, isn't it? Trump and tariffs back in the headlines.
You know what? It does feel a bit like 2018 all over again.
But jokes aside, this is a really big deal. Not just for Canada, but for us down here in the U.S. too.
Right. Tariffs are essentially like taxes on imported goods. So if this actually goes through, get ready to see prices jump on a whole bunch of stuff.
Like what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, think about all those goodies that come from Canada. Maple syrup, lumber, even cars.
Ouch. So basically, it's going to hit everyone's wallets pretty hard.
Yeah, pretty much.
And to really get into the nitty-gritty of this situation, we're taking a look at it from a particularly interesting perspective today. An opinion piece with a strong libertarian slant.
Now for libertarians, tariffs are like public enemy number one. They view it as the government sticking its nose where it doesn't belong, interfering with the free market, and ultimately hurting everyone involved, both producers and consumers.
The article actually goes so far as to call tariffs legally sanctioned theft.
Yeah, they don't mince words.
Which I kind of appreciate, to be honest. It definitely gets your attention. But before we get too deep into the libertarian perspective, I'm curious, how has Trudeau been handling this whole tariff threat so far?
Well, initially, he's been trying to play it cool, de-escalate the situation, avoid a full-blown trade war. But then things took a pretty dramatic turn.
Oh yeah, I remember this. Canada's finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, resigned.
Yep, she's out.
That's got to be a major blow to Trudeau.
For sure, it throws a wrench in the whole thing. And her resignation letter, well, let's just say she didn't hold back.
Oh really? Tell me more.
She basically criticized Trudeau's entire approach, warning about the potential economic fallout from a trade war and suggesting that he might be depleting Canada's resources to deal with this potential crisis.
Wow, she really went there. You know what they say, though? Where there's political turmoil, there's opportunity for someone else.
Oh, absolutely. And conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is not letting this moment slip away.
What's he been up to?
Well, he's been using the situation to his advantage, painting Trudeau as weak, indecisive, not fit to lead on the world stage.
Classic political maneuvering, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do wonder, is there any truth to Poilievre's criticisms? Could this whole internal conflict actually weaken Canada's position when dealing with the U.S.?
That's a really good question, and it's one we should definitely explore further, especially when you consider what's been happening with the polls lately.
Oh yeah, the polls.
The Conservatives have been surging ahead.
So could this whole tariff showdown potentially lead to a major power shift in Canada? Maybe even a move towards a more libertarian, less interventionist approach.
It's definitely within the realm of possibility. Things are getting very interesting up north, that's for sure. It's definitely a possibility that we could see some changes. And, this whole situation really highlights how interconnected our world is. What happens between the U.S. and Canada can have ripple effects globally.
Totally. It's like a domino effect, especially when it comes to things like trade and economics.
Yeah.
So let's talk about those ripple effects for a minute. If these tariffs actually go into effect, what could we be looking at?
Well, a full-blown trade war is rarely a pretty sight. We could see higher prices for consumers on both sides of the border, which could then lead to an economic slowdown, impacting jobs, businesses, you name it.
It's almost like shooting yourself in the foot. Everyone ends up getting hurt in the end. Let's break it down a little further. What specific sectors or industries could be hit the hardest?
Think about some of the key things that Canada exports to the U.S. lumber, for example. The Canadian lumber industry would definitely take a hit, and that could mean higher construction costs here in the U.S., potentially slowing down the housing market.
That's a great point, something that would directly impact American consumers and the U.S. economy as a whole. What about the impact on Canadian businesses, though?
Well, imagine you're a Canadian farmer who relies on exporting their crops to the U.S. Suddenly, their goods are hit with a 25% tariff, making them less competitive in the American market. They might have to scale back production, lay off workers, even face the possibility of losing their farm altogether.
That's tough to think about, the impact on people's livelihoods. And on a flip side, American consumers who love those Canadian products, things like maple syrup, certain types of fish, even cars,
Yeah.
they're going to see prices go way up.
Exactly. And that can lead to a decrease in demand, which further hurts the Canadian producers. It's a vicious cycle that can be hard to break out of.
So it seems like nobody really wins in a tariff war. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about potential solutions. Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution here? What would that even look like?
Ideally, both sides would come to the negotiating table, ready to engage in some good old-fashioned diplomacy, open communication, a willingness to compromise, recognizing that our economies are interconnected.
Makes sense. But let's be real for a second. Negotiations can be tricky, especially when you have strong personalities and different economic philosophies involved. What are some of the potential roadblocks we could see?
Well, remember that libertarian perspective we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the legally sanctioned theft argument.
Right. Well, those who subscribe to that viewpoint might be pushing for a complete rollback of the tariffs, no compromises. They see any government intervention in the market as a bad thing.
So from their viewpoint, any kind of government-imposed tariff is a no-go.
Pretty much, yeah. And then on the other side, you might have people who believe that tariffs are a necessary tool to protect domestic industries or to achieve certain economic goals like reducing trade deficits.
So finding that common ground could be a real challenge when you have such fundamentally different views on the role of government in the economy. A classic clash of ideologies.
Exactly. And beyond those ideological differences, there's also the issue of political posturing. Politicians on both sides might be hesitant to make concessions because they don't want to look weak to their constituents or like they're giving in to the other side.
It's all about saving face and scoring political points, sometimes at the expense of finding a solution that actually works for everyone.
Unfortunately, that's often how politics works. And in this case, it's not just about US-Canada relations, it's also about the internal politics within Canada. Trudeau is facing increasing pressure from the Conservatives, who are using this crisis to their advantage.
So he's kind of fighting a battle on two fronts, trying to de-escalate things with the US while also fending off attacks from his political rivals back home.
Exactly, it's a high-pressure situation. And how he handles it will be interesting to see. If he seems weak or indecisive in dealing with this tariff threat, it could hurt public confidence and strengthen the Conservative Party's position.
So the stakes are really high for Trudeau and for the future of Canadian politics. It feels like this tariff showdown is just the beginning. In terms of the potential shakeup it could cause?
I think you're right. And it's not just about Canada either. The outcome of this whole thing could have far-reaching consequences for the U.S. economy, for global trade relations, even for how we think about the role of government in a globalized world.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines, but you don't always stop to think about the real human impact and the potential domino effect these decisions can have.
That's the power of a good deep dive. It forces us to look beyond the surface and grapple with the complexities. And the situation is definitely complex. There are no easy answers or quick fixes.
We've talked a lot about the potential trade war between the US and Canada, and it's pretty clear the stakes are high. But I want to take a step back for a moment and really think about the human impact of all this. What would these tariffs actually mean for everyday people? The folks on both sides of the border.
It's easy to get lost in all the economic theories and political back and forth, but we have to remember that real people's lives are affected by these decisions.
Exactly. So let's try to put some faces to these statistics. What would this situation look like for a Canadian family, for example?
Imagine a family in a small Canadian town where the main industry is lumber. The father works at the local sawmill, and their livelihood depends on exporting lumber to the US. If those exports suddenly get hit with a 25% tariff, things could get really tough. We could be talking layoffs, reduced hours, maybe even the mill shutting down completely.
That's a scary thought. Their whole life could be turned upside down. And what about American consumers? We talked about rising prices, but how would that actually play out in their daily lives?
Think about everyday things that people rely on. Building a new house could become way more expensive if lumber prices shoot up. Or that delicious Canadian maple syrup you love on your pancakes. That might suddenly become a luxury item.
It's crazy how something like this can impact every part of our lives, from the big things like housing to the little things like breakfast. And it's not just the economic side of things either, right? There's also the potential for social and political unrest when people start feeling the pinch.
Oh, absolutely. When people are struggling to make ends meet, it can breed a lot of frustration and anger. We've seen it happen time and time again throughout history. Economic hardship can create the perfect conditions for social unrest, protests, even political instability.
It's a reminder that economics and politics are inseparable. And the choices made in one area can have huge consequences in the other.
That's exactly right.
And speaking of different perspectives, we've been looking at this situation through the lens of a libertarian opinion piece, which argues that tariffs are basically government overreach that harms both consumers and producers. What are your thoughts on that viewpoint?
Well, the libertarian perspective is valuable. It reminds us of the importance of free markets and the potential downsides of too much government involvement. But we also have to recognize that there are other points of view, and sometimes government regulation is necessary to protect consumers, ensure fair competition, or address problems that the market can't solve on its own.
It's all about finding that balance, right, between free market principles and government intervention,
Exactly, and it's a tough balance to strike.
especially in the middle of a political battle.
You got it.
So, where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to stay informed and engage in this conversation?
Well, stay curious. Keep learning. Explore different viewpoints. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Read articles. Listen to podcasts like this one. And most importantly, talk to people. Have respectful discussions with your friends, family, colleagues.
And remember, it's not just about understanding the economics or the politics. It's about recognizing the human impact of these decisions.
At the end of the day, it's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams, their ability to support themselves and their families. We have to keep that front and center as we try to navigate these complex challenges.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder everything we've discussed today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the potential U.S.-Canada trade war. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.